Well, hello everyone and welcome to my library. If you're new here, hello, my name is Chinsia, and if you're not new here and you're one of my lovely regulars, hi, how are you? I hope you're doing splendidly. We are talking about a field that I didn't really research much, but I was obsessed with growing up, and that was pirates. And you can blame the Pirates of the Caribbean, or technically Caribbean. I met someone from the Caribbean recently on a PhD course, and she says Caribbean. So I'm going to say Caribbean throughout this, but I've always said the Pirates of the Caribbean. Anyway, we are travelling to the Caribbean today. We are talking about pirates, and there's quite an extensive history on pirates, but I thought I'd touch ground on the thing that I was obsessed with as a child, and that is the Pirates of the Caribbean, or Caribbean, more specifically Blackbeard, because he's the first pirate that I heard about, and I feel like a lot of his, nature and little assets about his personality actually reflect on to the famous Captain Jack Sparrow, which you will see as we go through this quite extensive history of Blackbeard Pirate. But before we get into today's video, I'd like to take a quick moment to thank today's sponsor for making this video possible, which is Wondrium. Thank you, Wondrium. So if you're anything like me and you spend most of your free time learning, or you would like to spend more time exploring educational content and imaginative content, then you are going to love Wondrium. Wondrium is the premier entertaining and educational video subscription service that enriches your overall life experiences with accessible and fascinating content. Wondrium brings together trusted and inspiring experts and non-fiction storytellers from around the world to curate a gallery of curiosities featuring hours of video courses, documentaries, and series. If you're tired of consuming mindless content out of habit, then trust me, your brain will love this place. Wondrium is where you can find the answer to everything you've ever wondered about and introduce you to things that you've never imagined that you would wonder about. Their carefully curated collection of short and long-form videos, tutorials, how-tos, travelogues, and documentaries are accessibly academic and thoroughly researched, relentlessly entertaining, and presented by engaging experts. So if you watched my last video on the Sphinx, it was actually inspired by me watching The Great Tours, a guided tour of ancient Egypt over on Wondrium. The wonders of ancient Egypt have intrigued and dazzled humanity for thousands of years, and in this course you take a deep dive into the tombs, the temples, the palaces and the dwellings of the ancient Egyptians, where you'll explore the structure and meaning of the Egyptian pyramid, relive elaborate mystical rituals, discover sublime treasures of art, and learn in detail how the ancient Egyptians lived and died. What's wonderful about Wondrium, pun, is that you can enjoy it from just about anywhere, from your TV to your phone and laptop, so there's no excuse to procrastinate and mindlessly scroll on unfulfilling social media platforms when you could be discovering new passions and diving deeper into your favourites. So, subscribe to the Museum of the Mind today. Wondrium is very kindly offering a free trial to anyone who signs up to Wondrium by going to wondrium.com/Lady of the Library, which is linked in the description box below. So discover your new favourite place on the internet today. Thank you, Wondrium, for sponsoring today's video, and now let's talk all about pirates. It was a frightening time to be a sea merchant in the 18th century. Though pirates have been around since ancient times, the 17th and early 18th centuries were the golden ages of piracy, with more than 5,000 pirates said to have been at sea during this period. Pirates plundered coastal towns, attacked ships, and threw men overboard to attain goods, ranging from grain and olive oil stolen by ancient Grecian pirates to candles, soaps, silk, cotton, wood, spices, cocoa, and cannons by the 17th century. Now, one of the most feared pirates of his time was the legendary Blackbeard, a man with fierce, wild eyes who kept a brace of 3 pistols on a holster across his chest and a tall fur cap on his head. Lit matches were said to have made his wild and unruly beard, which he twisted into colourful little ribbons, and the smoke from these matches made his face light like a frightful meteor. Now, little is known about Blackbeard's life before he became the renowned pirate. According to Charles Johnson and his General History of the Most Famous Pirates from 1724, Blackbeard was most likely an English privateer during the War on the Spanish Succession, also known as Queen Anne's War. Blackbeard would have arrived in the Caribbean in the early 18th century, but like everything concerning Blackbeard's history, there's no concrete evidence to any of this. The same goes for his name and place of birth. Blackbeard is believed to have been born in or around Bristol, England, circa 1680, under the name Edward Teach. Now, because there's no standard characters for surnames in the 18th century, let alone many written records to support them, Blackbeard's surname varies amongst historical records and subsequent academic papers. So most refer to him as Edward Teach, but he's also been pronounced as Thatch, Thack, 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 Tack, Thatch, and Theach. As historical records, and people pick what they want to call him. I'm going to use Teach throughout this video, but just know that there's various ways of saying his surname, and if you read about this subject, then you may find various spellings of the surname. So Blackbeard's father, Edward Thack Sr. or Edward Teach Sr., was born in Stonehouse, Gloucestershire on June 14th, 1659, and was baptised 2 weeks later at St. Sire's Church. Blackbeard's grandfather is believed to have been Reverend Thomas Thack, who was the rector at the church before eventually moving to nearby Sapperton, Gloucestershire, where most of the family is buried. Edward Thack Sr. was a mariner, and he moved to Bristol after his marriage with his first 2 children, Edward Blackbeard and Elizabeth. Obviously he wasn't called Edward Blackbeard, I'm just referring to it anyway. He later actually remarried after the death of his first wife, and he had 3 more children. So when Britain began to gain control of the Caribbean from the Spanish in the 17th century, Barbados was captured in 1625 and Jamaica was later captured in 1655, attempts were made to obtain labour from Ireland and England. English servants could gain free passage to the New World by agreeing to be bound to an employer of a set number of years. Now, Bristol at the time was a major port for slave merchants, and its participation in the slave trade stretches to at least as far back as the 11th century. Irish and English slaves, or enslaved people, were routinely sold in the port from this time until the 1100s. Bristol's official involvement in the transatlantic slave trade started in 1698, when the London-based Royal African Company's monopoly on the trade ended. Which is worth noting because one member of the Royal African Company was the merchant Edward Colston, an Anglican Tory famed for his generosity to Bristol charities, hence why it's all at Bristol. Bristol has been an international port since medieval times, and was thus a prime location to exploit the profitable slave trade. Although no enslaved peoples were transported into Bristol, as enslaved markets were actually largely in the Americas and the Caribbean, the goods made in exchange for slaves were loaded onto the ships in Bristol, and goods such as tobacco and sugar were unloaded from the West Indies there. Bristol merchandise aimed at the Guinea trade included Guinea guns, brassware, alcohol, cloth, hats, and other, fancy goods. And these were sold to local African traders of enslaved people. And Bristol's ships supplied British colonies with a wide range of goods for the plantations, including guns, agricultural implements, foodstuffs, soaps, candles, ladies' boots, and clothing for the enslaved people. Now, how does this actually concern Blackbeard? Well, records show that the Teach or Thack family, with young Blackbeard, moved to the Spanish town in Jamaica around 1695, and his family actually owned a plantation and enslaved people, which were deeded to Blackbeard in 1706. Then, sometime between 1706 and 1713, Edward Teach, also known as Blackbeard, went from being a sailor in the Royal Navy abroad with the HMS Windsor to becoming a pirate. Now, Edward Teach is thought to have begun his life at sea as a British privateer in the War of the Spanish Succession, which happened between 1701 and 1714. The brief lowdown of the War of the Spanish Succession is that it was a conflict which arose when the childless Charles II, also sometimes known as Charles the Mad, died, and he was the last of the Spanish Habsburgs. The war was thus won over succession, and one which determined whether the vast possessions of the Spanish Empire should pass onto the House of Bourbon or the House of Habsburgs, or if they should be partitioned to preserve the power balance of Europe. Spoiler, there was a crap ton of battles and a conflict until finally the war concluded with the Peace of Utrecht, which marked the rise of British power at the expense of both France and Spain. During this time, Edward Teach would have plundered Spanish ships as a privateer in the West Indies on behalf of the British government. Privateers were privately owned rather than navy ships armed with guns. The Admiralty issued them with, quote, letters of marque that allowed them to capture merchant vessels without being charged with piracy. Well, let's just say that the experience as a privateer clearly taught him a lot, because after the war, we know that Edward turned his late father's estate over to his stepmother, Lucretia, for the, quote, love and affection I have for and bear towards my brother and sister Thomas Teach and Rachel Teach, who were his half-siblings. And then Teach became a pirate after meeting and joining up with Benjamin Hornigold around 1715, joining their pirate's den in Nassau in the Bahamas. It's an interesting turn of events that Edward became a pirate. Most people turned to piracy through desperation. After the war, thousands of privateers were left unemployed and unlicensed, and they didn't have prospects or even homes. However, Edward was a well-educated, literate man of social standing and family wealth, as demonstrated by his family actually owning a plantation. We believe he is quite literate based on evidence that we recovered from his ship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, which we'll talk about later. However, talking about this now, what they found on the ship was 16 fragments of paper in the wreckage, which shocked many, as before, most people presumed Blackbeard was an ignorant and violent thug. These fragments of paper were actually removed from the cannon mouth that was covered and sealed with a rag, delaying the destruction of the information contained within the letters. Despite 300 years of being underwater, of the 16 letters, 7 presented readable text. They found scriptures containing notes from books and copies of excerpts, which had a few paragraphs from the voyage of the South Sea and around the world by Edward Cook. In addition to the located section, other sections with incomprehensible words were also recovered. We're going to go back to the Pirates of the Caribbean, or Pirates of the Caribbean. And the reason that the film is located here is because of the historical connection of pirates in, you guessed it, the Caribbean. You see, when Christopher Columbus established contact between Europe and the lands that were later named America at the end of the 15th century, he was working for the Spanish monarchy. These new lands were claimed by the Spanish, who soon discovered them to be a rich source of silver, gold, and gems. From the 16th century, large Spanish ships, called galleons, began to sail back to Europe loaded with precious cargoes, which were practically asking to be plundered. Now, as the Caribbean had a very convenient access to the northern shipping lanes, pirates set up dens there, which is not a bad place at all. Now, the standard pirate ship held around 80 sailors, with the average age of them being 27, coming from all walks of life and seafaring experience. It's believed that Benjamin Hornigold began his pirate career in 1713 and became so established in Nassau that he helped establish the, quote, Republic of Pirates there. In 1717, Hornigold became captain of a heavily armed ship known as the Ranger, and having seen a lot of potential in him, he appointed Edward Teach, known as Blackbeard, as his second in command. Later that year, the pair plundered and captured several ships in the Caribbean, including the French-Dutch fleet known as the Concorde. It's believed that the Concorde was once stolen by French privateers who used it as a slave ship and renamed it La Concorde. However, when it came into Blackbeard's possession, he renamed it the Queen Anne's Revenge, and it became his flagship vessel. So let's talk about the Queen Anne's Revenge. When Blackbeard captured it, La Concorde, it was returning from a raid in Africa with a cargo of 516 Africans, who would have been, they phrase it as employed as labourers, but let's call it as it is, they were enslaved and hoping to work in Martinique, and the ship also had 9 kilos of powdered gold. Blackbeard left the enslaved people ashore along with some of the French crew, and he actually let them take his smaller ship whilst taking their big ship. Though don't get your hopes up, Blackbeard certainly wasn't an abolitionist. According to some accounts, Blackbeard actually auctioned off the enslaved people himself, and then others claim that the French crew that he let off the ship actually just rounded them back up and put them on the smaller ship, and then they went to be enslaved in Martinique. What's interesting about Blackbeard's new ship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, is that his flag depicted a skeleton stabbing a heart with its spear and toasting the devil with a glass in the other hand. This flag showed the danger that Blackbeard brought and his alliance with the devil. This was another technique used to instill fear in his enemies and to let them know just who was attacking them. Leaving Bequia in late November, Blackbeard cruised the Caribbean in the Queen Anne's Revenge, taking prizes and adding to his fleet. From the Grenadines, Blackbeard sailed north along the Lesser Antilles, plundering ships near St. Vincent, St. Lucia, Nevis, and Antigua. By early December, he had arrived off the eastern end of Puerto Rico. By April 1780, the pirates were off the Tenerife Islands in the Bay of Honduras. It was there that Blackbeard captured the sloop Adventure, forcing the sloop's captain, David Heriot, to join him. Do you mind not knocking my little camera, young man? Hello, do you want to come on camera? Come say hello to the people. Everyone wants to say hello to you. Yes. Sailing east once again, the pirates passed near the Cayman Islands and captured a Spanish sloop off Cuba, and they also added this to their flotilla, which is important because the flotilla is going to play a big role when it gets to the Americas. So turning north, they sailed through the Bahamas and proceeded up to the North American coast. In May 1718, the pirates arrived off Charleston, South Carolina, with the Queen Anne's Revenge, and the 3 smaller little sloops that they had stolen. In the most brazen act of his piratical career, Blackbeard blockaded the port of Charleston for nearly a week, seizing several ships attempting to enter or leave the port, and detaining the crew and passengers of one ship, the Crowley, and kept them as prisoners. As ransom for the hostages, Blackbeard demanded a chest of medicine. Once delivered, the captives were actually released, and the pirates continued their journey up the coast. After leaving Charleston, Blackbeard's fleet tried to enter the old Topsail Inlet in North Carolina, now known as the Beaufort. now known as the Beaufort Inlet. During the attempt, Queen Anne's Revenge and the sloop Adventure grounded on the sandbar and were actually abandoned. The remains of the ship were found nearly 250 years later, in 1996, and since then, 280,000 items have been recovered, including cannons, gold, plates, glass, chains, necklaces, and, most excitingly, rope. We love to find some good old rope. Blackbeard was an expert in psychological terror and employed pyrotechnics to strike terror in his victims. For example, some stories claim that he attached slow-burning fuses to his beard and his huge hat that he wore, allowing him to be surrounded by smoke throughout the encounter, creating the impression of a perpetual fog around him and frightening opponents to whom they compared him as a demon fresh from hell. Now, emphasis here is on stories. The odds of this being what he actually did is quite slim. He may have done it once, but the facial burns that he would have been subjected to would have been quite horrific. So he may not have done that very often if he did it at all. Regardless, he likely still dressed entirely in black and carried several pistols close to his chest, a sight terrifying enough for most people to surrender before a fight even started. Now this is notable, and where our allusions to Captain Jack Sparrow come in, because despite his horrific reputation at the time, there's no evidence that Blackbeard ever killed anyone before his final battle at Ocracoke, where he was actually fighting for his life. Blackbeard was thus a master of constructing a terrifying reputation without ever having to draw any blood. And this isn't a cowardly or passive move, it's an intelligent one. Scaring people was a far more sensible strategy than causing harm. As for a captain and a relatively small troop, the less damage to captured sloops, the better. To emphasise how incredibly effective Blackbeard's constructor persona was, we need to emphasise that in terms of piracy, Blackbeard wasn't the most successful. His iconic stature didn't pay off financially, especially when compared to fellow pirates at the time. For example, Henry Every is renowned as the world's most prosperous pirate, and this is quite interesting. So in 1695, Every learned that a Mughal Empire fleet was soon to set sail at the Red Sea port of Mocha on a voyage home to Surat, India. Along with carrying Muslim pilgrims returning from their Hajj to Mecca, the armada would also include several loot-filled merchant vessels and treasure ships owned by the Grand Mughal of India himself. So, Every partnered with several other pirate ships, including the Amity, an American raider captained by the famed buccaneer Thomas Tew. Thomas Tew. That's hard to say. Anyway, and he cruised the Red Sea in August 1695. There, Every managed to run down a lumbering escort vessel. After a brief firefight, the ship surrendered and was relieved of some 50,000 British pounds worth of gold and silver. Then, in September, Every's 3 remaining pirate ships caught up with the richest prize of the Indian fleet, the Grand Mughal flagship, Janji Sawai. Now, this battle was far more intense, as the Janji Sawai was very prepared to defend itself with several dozen cannons and 400 riflemen. Now, Every was taking a massive risk, but he struck lucky. One of the first cannon volleys that he shot out cut down the Janji Sawai's main mast, and then the rest of the conflict folded in Every's favour. Every and his crew sacked the ship, killing many of the sailors and passengers on board, and took away with them silver and gold worth somewhere between 325,000 and 600,000 British pounds, which today would be equivalent of tens of millions. So as you can see, he was the richest pirate out there, and Blackbeard doesn't have a story like this. He didn't bury treasure worth millions somewhere, and evidence suggests that he didn't even have the means to amass that great wealth. Additionally, considering his very famous and intense reputation, Blackbeard not only didn't kill people, he had a very short piratical career, only commanding ships for 2 years, from 1716 to 1718. And let's talk about that. In January 1718, Blackbeard formed a base at Ocracoke Island, just off North Carolina, and continued his acts of piracy, such as bribing the local governor, Charles Eden, for the royal pardon, and gaining the title as privateer to provide legal backing for his piratical actions. But his past acts were close on his heels, as by the 22nd of November 1718, Blackbeard met his maker. It would seem that his shameless exploits had angered Alexander Spotswood, the governor of Virginia. Spotswood assembled private pirate hunters under the command of Lieutenant Robert Maynard to overpower Blackbeard's forces. Maynard located Blackbeard and his pirates on Ocracoke Island, locked all exits, and entered the inlet, hoping to ambush them. However, Blackbeard had actually spotted the pirate hunter's ships and cut his anchor, attacking the ships outright with his cannons and destroying a third of the force within seconds. When the ships closed in, grappling hooks, smokes, and explosive grenades were thrown, and the pirates boarded the ship. However, Maynard had actually prepared for this eventuality, knowing what he was up against, and he had actually hidden the majority of his troops below the deck, ready to ambush the pirate boarders. And sadly, well, I say sadly, I'm on the side of the pirates here, but the ambush of Maynard worked. Blackbeard and Maynard allegedly fought man to man with pistols and swords, but Blackbeard was eventually wounded by one of Maynard's soldiers and overwhelmed by the rest of the crew. Blackbeard was shot at least 5 times and received over 20 blade wounds, making it difficult to tell which wound actually killed him. And then afterwards, his head was hung from the mast of the adventure sloop, and all but 2 of the captured pirates were eventually hanged. Much of what we know about Blackbeard is from Charles Johnson's book, A General History of the Robberies and Murders of the Most Notorious Pirates, which we can also credit for introducing the name of the pirate flag, the Jolly Roger, and also stories about pirates burying their treasure and the idea of missing legs and eye patches. Johnson's book directly inspired the works of J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan and Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island. And actually, Stevenson directly lifted one of the names of Blackbeard's crew from that book, Israel Hands, and then used it in the novel. So that's all there is to be said about Blackbeard the pirate, a man who had the most terrifying reputation without having to draw any blood and only pirated for 2 years before eventually having his downfall. I actually quite like the idea that he was kind of a pacifist pirate, and we can obviously see overlays with the Pirates of the Caribbean or Pirates of the Caribbean film and Captain Jack Sparrow with this. He's notorious, but actually it's quite harmless when it comes down to it. I hope you enjoyed this story about Blackbeard. If there's anything very similar you'd like me to cover, please leave a request down below. I've actually included a Google form in this video, so you can actually submit private Google requests for videos, so I don't lose them, because I get emails and comments and I get sidetracked, and I do grab as many as possible and pop them in a Notion folder, but I would happily like them in a form. So if you want to submit a video request, the form is down below. Thank you again to Wandrium for sponsoring today's video. Thank you to my Patreons for also being here and supporting this channel, and I'll see you very soon for another video. And remember, books save lives, so keep reading.